Gecko Part 2. Jason sat silently for a moment, stunned by the thought of what he had just done. Now a lizard was hiding in the dark places of his apartment, along with the cockroaches. He tried to comfort himself by picking up the newspaper article and reading it again. Finally, with wary steps, he walked into the kitchen and began to make himself dinner. Jason took his food into the living room and sat down in front of the television to eat. He watched a long movie that took his mind off the gecko until he flicked off the set at midnight, feeling strangely exhausted, and stumbled into his bedroom and got ready for the night. Jason lay down in bed and shut his eyes, feeling as though he could sleep forever. As sleep began to slowly steal over his mind, a strange crunching sound broke the silence of his apartment. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Jason's body tensed, and then he sat bolt upright in bed. He strained his ears, waiting for the sound to come again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. A second later, a weird bark pierced the quiet of the night, shattering Jason's nerves. Gecko, gecko, gecko! The sound of the gecko's bark made Jason's blood run cold. He fell back in bed and pulled the covers up tightly around his neck. His mind fled back to the newspaper article. It had never mentioned the horrible crunching sound that the gecko made as it ate the hard shells of the cockroaches, and it never had said how loud the gecko barked. Then Jason remembered that his gecko was bigger than most, and maybe that's why it was so loud. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The gecko was eating another cockroach. The sound scratched at Jason's brain like fingernails against a chalkboard. He buried his head under a pillow, but even the pillow couldn't keep out the gecko's bark of triumph as it swallowed its prey. The next morning, Jason stumbled into the bathroom and stared at his drawn, white face in the mirror. A strange glint played in his dark eyes, and his lips were pale and pulled down at the corners into an anxious grimace. He wondered if anyone would notice how he looked at work today. He wondered how he would get through the day at all. When he finally left the office at 5, Jason began to follow his old route home. But as he drew closer and closer to his building, he began walking slower and slower. He didn't want to go back to his apartment where the gecko was waiting for him in the dark. Jason stopped at a small Italian restaurant to eat an inexpensive meal of spaghetti for dinner. Afterward, he went to see a double feature at a movie theater, which lasted for 4 hours. Finally, just before midnight, he pushed open the door to his apartment. As Jason flicked on the entrance light, a weird bark shattered the silence. He jumped and then looked straight up at the ceiling above his head. The gecko's striped body was pressed there. It was crunching on a half-dead cockroach. For a few seconds, Jason stared at it in horror. The gecko seemed to have grown during the day, and it was staring at him as though it was still hungry. Jason ran for his bedroom and slammed the door shut. He locked it behind him and stood shaking in the dark. The gecko couldn't have followed him that quickly, he told himself. He was safe here in the bedroom. Nervously, he undressed, slipped into bed, and lay there trembling. He tried to calm his nerves and soothe his mind into sleep. There would be no crunching tonight, he told himself. No crunching, no barking, only sleep. Then, out of the darkness, came the sound. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Jason screamed in panic as his nerves snapped. The gecko was somewhere in the room, hunting and eating. He buried his head in the covers, but still he couldn't shut out the gecko's bark as it set off to find another victim in the dark bedroom. The next morning, Jason watched his shaking hand spill coffee from his cup. Again, the gecko had kept him awake almost all night with its murderous crunching and barking. But Jason noticed that there was only one cockroach in the kitchen that morning, and there had been none in the bathroom. Slowly but surely, the gecko was stalking and killing them, one by one, through those long nights. Just then, Jason saw the gecko dart from his bedroom into the kitchen. He choked back a scream as he saw the gecko's bloated body barely squeezing under the refrigerator. It had grown even bigger during the night. Suddenly, Jason put down his coffee and stared at the wall as a new thought crept into his mind. What would happen if the gecko ran out of roaches to eat? By the end of the week, Jason could not find one roach anywhere in his apartment, no matter how hard he searched. There were none in the refrigerator, none scurried away when he came in the door at night, None hid under the wastebasket in the bathroom or inside the magazine on his nightstand. Jason had noticed something else. The gecko's crunching had become louder and louder, but less and less frequent during the night. Still, Jason had not slept. Now, the silence worried him as much as the crunching had. That evening, Jason watched television until his eyes burned with fatigue. Finally, he crept into his bedroom and lay there perfectly still in the dark. He waited and waited for the crunching sound to come. But the room was quiet as a tomb. In his mind, Jason pictured all the places where the gecko might be. Was it lurking on the dusty floor under his refrigerator? Was it pressed up against the warm glass of his television screen? Or was it in his dark bedroom? Maybe it was crawling across the ceiling above him at that very moment. Maybe it was hungry. Late that night, the police rushed into the apartment building to answer a call from Jason's next door neighbor. She reported terrible screams coming from his apartment, followed by a weird crunching sound and then a blood-curdling bark. The police broke down Jason's locked door and searched the apartment. Jason was nowhere to be found. His bed was empty, and although they looked everywhere else, the police forgot to look under the bed. There, hiding in the dark, was the bloated gecko, full at last.